Hello, this is John Jacobs, Senior Pastor at the Village Chapel. I'm here with the author, Paul Dunn, who is a historian living here in Pinehurst, North Carolina. He has written a 4-volume diary which recounts Abraham Lincoln's thoughts during the Civil War. It also includes Lincoln's recurring dreams. Lincoln was a melancholy president, and his dreams often reflect his dark moods. The book describes battles won and lost, Lincoln's interactions with his cabinet, members of Congress, military and naval officers, and the members of his family and his staff. Throughout the first volume, and we find the president learns by trial and error which of his commanders can be relied upon to bring about badly needed victories. Lincoln died intestate and never wrote a diary. The author attempts to bring to the reader the kind of diary that Abraham Lincoln might have written had he actually done so. And now, Paul.
Yes, sir.
I would ask you, before I begin asking you specific questions about Abraham Lincoln, asking you about the things that I think so many people would like to know about him, and especially in a church context, about how his belief in God and his spiritual upbringing might have had something to do with who he was as the president that kept the Union together. Would you tell us what it was that inspired you to write this book?
Yeah, well, I would say that I started out having spent many years reading about Lincoln. And I'd written a couple of books about golf when I came down here. And I thought, I've had enough golf. I must do something else. And I always wanted to write about Lincoln, but I felt there'd been almost 20,000 books written about this man, more, I think, than about Jesus Christ. It's hard to believe, but it's a huge number of books, and they come out all the time. And so I said to myself, what could I possibly write that everybody else hasn't already written? And there are many common themes throughout all of these books. And I said to myself, well, I wonder if he ever wrote a diary. And I contacted his museum out in Illinois, Springfield, Illinois. It's a wonderful museum. And they have great people, great staff. You can ask him anything. I would call them up and say, do you happen to know what the name of his son's dog was? And they would tell me. Anything I asked, they always had this information. And so I asked him, I said, do you know if he ever attempted to write or kept any kind of a diary? And they said no, to the best of their knowledge, there wasn't anything like that. And so I said, well, how would one go about doing that? And I discovered one book, and this book was developed by the U.S. government. People criticize the U.S. government for all kinds of things, but the U.S. government had the wisdom to set up a committee or a commission or something, and these people researched everything they could find that Lincoln had ever written in his whole life, from little poems as a kid all the way through his life. And not only did they put this record together, but it's put together by date chronologically, from the day he started writing until his assassination. So this big, thick book exists. Therefore, during the Civil War, I could look in that book, and for any certain date, I could see, well, he had a cabinet meeting. They would list who was at the cabinet meeting. they could tell me what happened on a certain battle date and so forth. So I figured out, well, it would be very possible to reconstruct his diary as if he had written it. And so that's how I sort of got into it. And the way I would do it was each day I would say to myself, if I were Lincoln and I was just about to go to bed, what might I put down in a book? And so I would try to put myself in his shoes, read everything I could for that date that he had done, and then make entries. And it started out as a slow process, I'll tell you, but finally I got into a groove with it. What happened was I almost began to feel like I was Abraham Lincoln because I was living his life in this very strange way. And it also allowed me to, when you mentioned his dreams, it allowed me to research what had been written about his dreams. Mary believed in dreams. He didn't necessarily, but he would talk about them to people. He had one dream where he dreamt that he was in a dark room at the White House, and he could hear wailing going on in the next room, and he walked in there. It was dark, and there were a lot of people. They were all crying and weeping. And he said, "What's happened? What's happened?" They said, "Well, the president's been shot." And that woke him up, but that happened, I guess, 6 months before the assassination, and he had told people about that. So I tried to put some of that in the book, the dreams that he was reputed to have had, or that he might have had, based on certain situations. So it was an opportunity to spend lots of time with accurate facts to serve as the basis for the 4 books. Yeah.
Well, as a historian, I'm sure you would agree that to some extent we are limited in the facts of history, and to speculate beyond that, as some people do. Well, talking about the Civil War, had Stonewall Jackson not been killed by his own troops at Chancellorsville, what might have happened? Things like that. Had Robert E. Lee not decided to charge Cemetery Ridge with Pickett's charge, and had done something differently at Gettysburg, what might have happened? People who care a great deal about history tend not to do that. But I see that what you're trying to do is to embellish and add to what we already know, what might have happened, and not in any way to contradict what Lincoln was doing in the White House. You see, I see Lincoln during that war, and basically his entire presidency was as a commander-in-chief of our troops, the Union troops. I see him in a state of conflict with his family, with his staff, certainly with many of his commanders, especially McClellan.
Oh, sure.
And yet at the same time, in a conversation with God, and thinking about the book that he grew up reading, the King James Version of the Bible, and how it might have informed his decisions and the way he thought about the reality around him. And that's what I'm really interested in, because again, he didn't choose to join a church, a denominational church. And yet he talked more about God and quoted the Bible, I think, more than any other president we've ever had. And so I'd like to know what you think about that part of him and what his spiritual life did to contribute to the decisions he made as a president, and how, and well, just how he held up physically and emotionally and spiritually during the greatest crisis this country has ever known.
Yeah, it's a big question.
Uh-huh.
He started out with only one book in the house.
Yeah.
And he also had a mother and a stepmother who, well, they were not Bible thumpers, and they were not particularly outspoken religious, but they were very saint-like, and they saw in him a special nature that his father never saw. His father and he had a bad relationship.
Well, he was an abusive father.
Well,
And neglectful father.
Well, he when the boy was strong enough, he would sort of rent him out as a laborer.
Yeah.
And he'd cut logs all day and be paid $1, let's say. And the father would keep the dollar and say, not even a thank you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But these two women were a big influence on his life in terms of inspiring him to know right from wrong.
Mm-hmm.
When he was called Honest Abe, there was a reason he was called Honest Abe. He was incredibly honest. And again, this had to have come out of that family situation with these two women
Mm-hmm.
that taught him very early on that there's a right, there's a wrong. One time he got a letter from one of his clients, and he had enclosed $10 for Abe having written a will, or $20, whatever the amount was, and Abe was furious. And he wrote back to this man and said, what kind of a lawyer do you think I am? I don't charge that kind of money. And he sent him back half of whatever this man had sent him, because he had this instinctive feeling for the people he served and their ability to pay. I had mentioned at one point his relationship with women. He took particular interest in protecting the rights of women in the legal sense as well as every other sense.
At a time when they had very few rights.
Well, for example, I forget the year, but he was one of the first people to come out for the right to vote for women. And because he said to himself, why are half these people here disenfranchised? Why aren't they treated,
And that's about 70 years before they got the right.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
He had one case where he had this woman who apparently had killed her husband, at least that was the suspicion. She'd been abused and so forth. And she was in court in the morning and he was defending her. And then they had a recess and he went out with her and he came back and she wasn't back in the courtroom. And the judge says, where is Mrs. So-and-so? And he said, well, I don't know, Your Honor. He says, I don't know what happened to her. He says, well, did you say something to her? He said, well, she asked me where you get a good drink of water, and I told him Indiana. So she disappeared. He had a wonderful sense of humor.
Mm-hmm.
And part of that stemmed from the fact that he would travel the circuit, and he'd be away from his wife and family for 6 weeks sometime,
Mm-hmm.
just traveling with these other lawyers and a judge. Sometimes he was so trusted that sometimes the judge would say, hey, why don't you be the judge in this case, because I'm a lawyer here and I'm going to be trying the case.
Sure.
So he would be the judge, he'd be the lawyer. And spending all his time with these men, he would get to tell them stories to keep their spirits up. When he became president, some of the cabinet members didn't like this practice because they could be going through the worst possible situations with the war, and he always had a funny story. A lot of that stemmed from his youth when he lost his mother early. He lost a sister. There was a young brother who I think may have just died in childbirth. I'm not sure what happened with him, but there was a lot of tragedy. Then one of the first women he got romantically interested in, she died suddenly. That depressed him, and he became suicidal. People didn't want him to have a knife, for example. All of that was written by people who knew the situation. So there was a lot of tragedy in his life. So he would look to humor. And of course, during the Civil War, the tragedy was unbelievable. And so many of his personal friends were killed in these battles. The first officer killed outside of Alexandria, Virginia, was his best friend. Man ran into a house, went up the stairs. He saw somebody flying a rebel flag or something. He tore it down. The homeowner shot and killed his best friend. So it was tragedy every day.
And he had relatives by marriage who were fighting for the South.
Oh, yeah. One of Mary's brothers, who he was very fond of, just when the war was breaking out or had just broken out, he invited him to the White House and he offered him to be the quartermaster general of the army.
Yeah.
He had great respect for this man. He said, well, I just am obligated to defend my state, which is what happened with Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee was offered the top job
That's right.
in the army by General Scott. And again, Lee, who had taken the oath, had gone to West Point, was a hero. He was the man who captured John Brown, of all things, But he felt he had this obligation. And
one of the benefits of the Civil War, or consequences of it, is that we no longer think that way in this country about our states. That our states are our country. That our states deserve a loyalty above the United States. And so back then they didn't think that. And it's hard for us to understand that.
Oh, you take Jefferson Davis. I mean, Jefferson Davis had fought in the Indian Wars. He had, he got to know Jefferson Davis. When Jefferson Davis did not want the states to secede, but when they did, they elected him president. Throughout the entire war, there was correspondence between Lincoln and Jefferson Davis, and it was very respectful. Lincoln would never think not to treat him with honor, even though he was, quote, the enemy, because he always thought that when this is over, we'll all be one again.
That's right.
And people kept saying, well, what are we going to do with Jefferson Davis when this is over, because we're getting to the end? And he would say, well, maybe he'll just sort of disappear. Maybe he'll just go to Cuba or Mexico or something. He didn't want to deal with the thought. And of course, when he was assassinated and they captured Jefferson Davis, they put him in prison for 2 years. He never would have stood for that. Yeah. It was, he had these personal views that were old-fashioned in the sense of honor.
That's
and
right.
It was remarkable when you think of the pressure on all sides.
I think about constantly, when I look at the Civil War, the stress and the pressure that Lincoln was under. How once he said, if there's a place worse than hell, I'm there. And he meant it. And I'm just interested in how he was able to hold up and stand and stay functional, and more than just functional, to guide this country against all odds. And how did that happen with a person who was probably not an Orthodox Christian in the sense of accepting the incarnation of Jesus and the Trinity of God? and yet believing that we should love God with all our hearts, minds, and souls, and love our neighbor as ourself. He truly did believe that.
Well, see,
And in fact said, if there were ever a church that just believed that, I'd join that
oh,
church.
sure. But see, he was a lawyer, and as a lawyer
Yeah.
yourself, you understand, he had the lawyer's nature of analyzing all the facts.
Yeah.
And studying every angle.
Mhm.
His law partner, he used to drive him crazy because they had an office together, a very small little office, and he'd read everything out loud.
Hmm.
And he could never say, well, Abe, can't you just read that yourself? No, he liked to read it out loud because he felt when he read it out loud, he remembered it better.
Yeah.
And when he would make a pitch to the jury, it would come back to him.
Right.
He approached things in a very analytical way. Well, there's a lot about religion that doesn't lend itself to legal analysis, so to speak. Much of it's very spiritual. But he was the kind of guy that always wanted to find the exact answer. He was very determined. Before he said something, he'd like to believe in it and know he could prove it. You can't prove everything in religion. But he also, he read that Bible all the time
Mm-hmm.
throughout this whole period. And he would have people come down. A lot of Quakers came down. A lot of religious people called him. The door was always open to them.
Mm-hmm.
And they'd say, well, what about the slaves? I mean, why don't you feel motivated, moved?
Mm-hmm.
Why isn't something sparking you to free these slaves? And he would say to them, if I could get that message from God, I sure would act upon that. But he said, I'll be very honest with you, I just don't get that message.
Yeah.
And he was candid with them.
Do you think it's fair to say that Lincoln was a politician? And I would say that the consummate and complete politician first, before he was a believer in God.
Oh yeah, he was a consummate politician. He also was misunderstood. A lot of people thought he was an abolitionist. He was just the opposite. He didn't believe in abolition.
Yeah.
The one document that every American should read is his speech at Cooper Union. Because
Yes.
when he spoke at Cooper Union, and this was up in New York.
This was during his campaign.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He decided to explain as a lawyer, as a candidate, but also as a lawyer, the history of slavery as it related to the founding fathers.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a brilliant analysis, historic analysis. And here he was, he had a squeaky voice, and here he was with all these sophisticated New Yorkers. And he sort of looked like a rube from the country, poorly dressed.
Mm-hmm.
His pants never quite came up far enough on his shoes. And he laid out this explanation of the basis for the way slavery was understood by the founding fathers.
Mm-hmm.
It was brilliant.
Yeah.
And of course, he then went up into New England and gave the same speech in parts to audiences all over the place. And the one nice thing about that period was there was no television, there was no radio, but newspapers, not only would they print your remarks, they'd print everything.
Yeah.
I mean, they would print pages, just like the Lincoln-Douglas debates.
Mm-hmm.
There were 7 of them, and they printed literally everything. Yeah. Yeah, Douglas regretted he ever debated Abraham Lincoln. Yeah.
And again, the Cooper Union was in New York,
Oh yeah.
and that was during his campaign.
Yeah.
And that was one of the most important events in getting him elected as president, because as you say, the media, the newspapers were there, and they, in effect, introduced Lincoln to New York.
Oh yeah, and New York was a sophisticated market.
Yeah.
And his reputation was sort of this rube out there, the rail splitter.
Right.
Maybe not quite intellectually in their camp, in their league, so to speak. And when they heard what he had to say and his analysis, they were floored.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it was brilliant. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I wonder today if we had Lincoln here, what he would say about the polarization of this country. Do you think? Obviously, it's not on the level of people picking up guns and shooting at each other, although it is a violent country.
Well,
But
yeah,
what would he say about the divisions in this country post Civil War? What might he say about the way that black people have been integrated or not into society over these last, 150 years? Because this is kind of the book that you've written. You've speculated somewhat. And I would ask you to speculate a little bit more. If Lincoln were here, what do you think he might say, just by way of observation, not necessarily judging us in any way, but just saying, here's how I might have thought the country would look like now, and here is how it's different.
Well, the most recent traumatic event, of course, was January 6th,
Mm-hmm.
where you had people at the instigation of a president encouraged to attack the Congress of the United States. Think of that. There's no way that Lincoln could comprehend that. I mean, beyond his understanding. How could a president of the United States encourage people and refuse to accept the results of an election? Never have happened. So that, I think that would be so beyond his comprehension that he'd be stunned. Yeah.
Yeah. And well, the summer before, when the White House was attacked for several days by Black Lives Matter and Antifa, and the president at that time and his staff had to go into hiding underground for several days by the Secret Service. That's probably something we don't remember as much, but still, we're seeing a country that is divided, and
Well, you've got
I just wonder
strange
what advice Lincoln might say to us.
Yeah, you've got strange things going on. For example, you've got QAnon, and QAnon believes things that are mind-boggling, and yet there are thousands and thousands of people in this country that believe these things.
Mm-hmm.
And Lincoln believed in the truth, and he was a man of honor, and he couldn't abide by that sort of thing. Yeah.
What? Oh, I'm sorry. Well, he quoted Jesus in Mark's Gospel, which is our Gospel reading for this Sunday,
Is it? Good for you.
saying that a house divided cannot stand. That was when Jesus was accused of being on the side of Satan. And Jesus said, how can I cast out Satan and be against Satan and at the same time be on his side? It doesn't work. A house divided cannot stand. And we've used that phrase in so many ways that may and may not be applicable in all situations. And I wonder, when I think about what Lincoln might say to us today, in the polarization of our country, whether he might say, there are divisions that might actually work out in the long run, like a divorce that needed to happen. And
Well, I think that's true. But the paradox is, he was the first Republican president.
mhm,
And my family were all Republicans from day one.
mhm, mhm.
And today, I mean, you can't get Republicans to agree that Joe Biden is the president of the United States.
Mhm.
That party is really in trouble.
Mhm.
And I think Lincoln would be flabbergasted because he understood a very simple idea. You have elections, you honor the elected people, and you govern. The one big mistake he made was not insisting on who be put up as vice president when he ran the second time,
Mhm.
because Johnson was a bad guy. He was a racist, and of course
He was from Tennessee.
Oh yeah, and
Yeah.
he did not want to have a generous resolution between the North and South at the end,
Mhm.
and it led to lots of years of trouble.
Mhm.
But Lincoln never thought he'd die.
Yeah.
Whereas the guy he had in there, Hamlin, was a great vice president. Would have been a safe bet. But that again is one of the happenings of history.
Mhm.
Can't predict things.
Yeah. Well, I find it interesting that Lincoln, as a spiritual man, perhaps not an Orthodox Christian, but someone who did care so deeply about a unified United States, how his religion, whatever that was, contributed to that, and what he might say to the president that we have now, or the president that we would have next. How might you be able to influence people by the way that you believe in God? Can a president do that today? Or is the president asking for trouble by saying, here's what I think about what God wants for this country? And even just expressing it as his own opinion. Are we at a place in this country's history where there's such a separation of church and state as we had not seen back then, that a president is just asking for trouble if he ever says really anything specific about God and about what God's will might be for America?
Oh yeah, in some of these addresses that Lincoln gave, you'd find 17 or 20 different references to the Almighty in one speech.
That's right.
Now today, I don't think that happens too often.
No. Well, wouldn't it be fair to say you open yourself up to criticism? That you're excluding people who don't believe in God, excluding, all those many people who have immigrated to this country since the Civil War, who have different religions.
Oh, sure.
And you're supposed to be the president for everyone. And yet at the same time, are you not allowed as the president to exercise your own First Amendment rights and to express what you believe? Or do you have to, forget about them for those 4 years that you're in office and not talk about it? And if that's the case, and I think it is, then what does that say about where we are now as a nation in contrast to 150 years ago.
Well, you even see it in the Supreme Court. His approach to the Supreme Court is very different than it's been for the last years, really.
Mm-hmm.
Try and pick somebody based on whether they're really Republican or Democrat.
Mm-hmm.
He tried to pick them based on whether they were good judges and were smart lawyers. It never would have dawned on him to wonder what their views were on abortion or something. You know, he picked men he thought would be excellent, and
Yeah.
he did pretty well. Yeah. Matter of fact, one of the guys who lived in this town, his great-great-grandfather was its first justice, Swain. He knew him, yeah. And his only claim to fame was he voted that income taxes were legal. But no, there's no two ways about it. We had these ministers who promote the moral majority or whatever, and or a guy like Franklin Graham, and their views are very extreme, I think, compared to during his day. In his day, he would welcome everybody in of a religious nature, Quakers, Jews, and he was very strong on the chaplaincy. He believed that it was very important to the troops to have good chaplains, and a lot of those chaplains died in the war. It's amazing the large number of serving chaplains who died.
Mm-hmm.
But he also had a close relationship with the Archbishop of New York, who went to Europe and did some lobbying almost for the Union side. He realized the importance of people who could strengthen the faith of the soldiers.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, very much so.
Well, I have 2 letters here in this office that I've saved and preserved. And one of them is a letter from a relative of my wife to the Bishop of Massachusetts during the Civil War, dated 1862.
Isn't that interesting?
And that was Phillips Brooks, who wrote O Little Town of Bethlehem.
Wow,
But he was a confidant of Lincoln,
interesting.
and in fact gave a funeral oration to
Wow.
Lincoln in Washington. But I also have another letter that was written by a Confederate chaplain who was also one of the founders of my university, and he had spent the whole war on behalf of the Confederacy as a chaplain and survived. And it's interesting, he was writing this letter after the war to a Union commander,
Wow.
General Schofield, who was the hero at Franklin and Nashville. And they were just getting back together after the war and talking about some friends who had died and that kind of thing. And so, anyway, people did get back together after the war, and it's unfortunate that Lincoln did not live to see that and also help to make it happen. As you say, Andrew Johnson was not the president that we needed at that time. That Lincoln would have been. Lincoln would have been the president to bring this country back
Sure.
together. And I'm wondering right now, and this will be the last thing I ask you, what kind of president do we need now that can reconcile this country and bring us back together, and so that we're not as polarized as we are now? Or is that even possible? When we think about what Lincoln was up against, we might think today, how did he do it? Well, there was a war. We don't want a war. with Americans killing each other. How do we prevent that? And what might a president do today to prevent that?
Yeah, it's so complicated. For example, every day, not every week, but every day, you see gun shootings in this country. Matter of fact, in my own family, my sister's granddaughter was shot up at Connecticut. She was one of those kids in that schools.
Mm-hmm.
This country can't even figure out how to agree to treat bullets, big cartridges, holders of bullets, and automatic rifles that can kill lots of people. We can't deal with things as simple as that. All these things become, wearing masks or not wearing masks, getting vaccinated or not getting vaccinated, everything takes on a political tone. It's hard to believe, but we've gotten ourselves into a mess.
Yeah, and I don't think we can even agree on who's politicizing it. I don't think. I think both sides are pointing fingers and saying, you're making this political. And the other side is saying, you're making it political. And as long as we're doing that, we're kind of at a standstill.
Yeah, I read the biography of Walter Cronkite the other night.
Uh-huh.
And in his day, there was no cable, there was no Fox News, it was just ABC, NBC, and CBS. And when he told Lyndon Johnson that we should get out of Vietnam, it was bad news. It didn't make sense. That was the end of the Vietnam War, really. Cronkite was the kind of voice that people would listen to. There's no voice like that today. People listen to Fox, or they listen to Rachel Maddow, and never the twain shall meet.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's amazing.
Yeah. Well, in a democracy, we need to be able to disagree with each other.
Oh, no two ways.
The question is, how do we disagree?
Without shooting each other.
and at least we're not picking up guns and shooting each other as in a civil war.
Oh, yeah.
But I think what we look forward to is the kind of leadership that could unite us, if that's possible, as opposed to leadership that separates us. And I think what we're seeing is more separation than unification.
Oh, I agree with you. It's
And
scary.
and maybe it can't happen politically. Maybe it has to start right here in the churches, talking about unification. And we can do it because we don't have to worry about getting elected in the next term. And maybe that's where it has to start. Well, thank you.
Well, thank you.
Thank you for your time. And I hope we can come back together again
Well, it's very
and
kind.
continue talking.
Well, we solved 90% of the problems.
Thank you so much, Paul.
Well, thank you.